bank of lights off because of this?
No.
Okay. I thought I turned both lights on. Did I just switch them when I turned them on?
No.
Oh, okay. I guess one of them was on and one of them wasn't on when I... Okay. Well, let's review just briefly what we've seen up to this point. For those of you who may not have been here before this, or at least this last week, we did sort of a general review of what we've been looking at as to why we believe the book of Revelation is actually focused upon first century Judaism, and why this is God's judgment against Israel for their rejection of the Messiah. Remember Revelation chapter 1 verse 7. Behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn over him. Remember that the word there, even, means that is, so that every eye will see him, that is, those who pierced him. And that's very telling, especially since if this applies to AD 70, which is the direction we're going, those who pierced him, at least many of them, would still be alive at that time to be able to see him. And also all the tribes of the earth will mourn over him, most likely referring to the tribes of Israel, the tribes of the land, because the word earth can also mean land. And they would be mourning over him not in repentance, but rather because they realize what they have done, and they realize they're coming under the Lord's judgment for having killed his Messiah. And they realize that's very serious. Okay, we also saw that the image of his coming on the clouds actually is an image used in the Old Testament several times to refer to the Lord's coming in judgment against the nation. The clouds are God's chariots, as you'll have to look at the handout from section 7. We have several examples of that in the Old Testament, where the Lord calls the clouds his chariot, and he's often seen riding on the clouds as he comes to bring judgment upon a nation. We saw other indications in the New Testament that the Great Tribulation was going to be focused on Judea, such as the warning Jesus gave to his disciples on the, what we call the Olivet Discourse, as they asked him about the buildings and the temple, and Jesus said, "You see all these things, not one stone will be left upon another. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet," notice when you see it, then flee out of the city, flee into the country, into the mountains, get away, because there's a time of vengeance coming. Jesus also said that generation would not pass away until all those things had been fulfilled, and it's very unlikely that he would use the word generation in an entirely new sense to refer to a race of people that they would not be extinct before these things took place. But what he was saying was that generation of Jews living, and actually it may not have just been confined to the Jews, but the generation then living would not pass away until everything that he is mentioning in Matthew chapter 24 would take place. Also, a statistic, Josephus said that it was actually 1,100,000 Jews roughly died in this war, so that was a tremendous judgment against Israel. We saw also some of the terms used in the New Testament, last days, signaled by the outpouring of the Spirit of God. That last days of what? Well, it could be referring to the last epic of history, because the Old Testament time frames, the antediluvian time frames, all these time frames have taken place, but now we're into the last days, and those could project all the way up until the time Jesus returns. Or it could have been referring to the time then, that they were in the last days then, the last days of the closing of the old covenant system, which was already defunct by Christ's work on the cross. It's been fulfilled, and so now it's going to pass away. Though there's an overlap of time as the Lord lets the gospel go out. The whole world needs to hear the gospel before the end comes, and basically his disciples who are charged with the Great Commission go out and they evangelized the entire Roman Empire, which was the whole world in those days. At least in Jewish mind and in Roman mind, they were world conquerors. And so if the Roman Empire was evangelized, and then the whole world has received the gospel, then the end comes. The book of Acts is that time frame. And they go to the Jew first in order to bring the gospel to them. When they reject, they turn to the Gentiles. But eventually it goes all the way to Rome. Paul's takes it there on his trip to Rome as he appeals to Caesar, and in the closing of that time frame, judgment still hasn't come upon Israel, but that's the very next thing that takes place. We also saw the book of Hebrews has several references to the fact that what is old and is obsolete is ready to pass away, so don't be a part of that system when it passes away. We began to look also at some of the Jewish character of the book of Revelation. We've already seen some of that in the introductory verse, in chapter 1, verse 7, about every eye will see him, all the tribes of the land shall mourn. But obviously there are the references, and we're going to see several more today as well. One that's very prominent is the 144,000. The sealing of 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And the question, of course, what does that have to do with? Well, that's the reason why dispensationalists see the Lord turning back again to Israel, because of the Jewish character of the book. But what we're talking about here is that this is God dealing with the Jews in first century Judaism, not sometime in the future. So anyway, there is a very strong emphasis in the book on Jews and this Jewish character of the book. Okay, well, that's a quick summary. Is it getting too warm in here already? Maybe someone could turn the fan on. And by the way, there are some marks on there now, those little pencil marks. If you turn those until they're pointing straight up, then it should be where it needs to be, each of the fans, because they all operate a little bit differently as far as the speed. Okay, well, let's move into part 8. I hope you all have those handouts this morning. And we're going to look at the overall thrust of the book. As we already know, it is God's judgment against Israel for their rejection of the Messiah. But the way that it's characterized in the book, at least one of the ways, is that of covenant divorce. By the way, we are following Gentry's thoughts here. This is, again, what we call moderate preterism, and the idea that these things were fulfilled back in first century Judaism in AD 70, God's judgment against the Jews. But and this is radically different than what we often hear today as far as what God's plan is for Israel, because we're still expecting God to turn back to ethnic Israel and to deal with the people as a whole. My Bible instructor in college said that he believed that there was going to be a revival among the Jews, that God was going to turn to them and save them all as a nation. But the indications that we have from the New Testament, and especially from the book of Revelation, is that God has set ethnic Israel aside for good, although He is still dealing with Israel, but it's the elect Israelites. Not Israel as a nation anymore, with elect Israelites within the nation, but now He set the nation aside. He's only dealing with the elect Israelites that are in that nation. And He's not going to be dealing with the whole nation as ethnic Israel, or as, let's just say, the seed according to the flesh again, in the way that some conceive of. And that's because of their rejection of the Messiah. They were the Lord's bride, but the Lord is putting them off for their infidelity, for their adulteries. Israel has become a harlot, as it were. That's the way that she's pictured in the book of Revelation. So that's what we're going to be looking at now. Let's look at a theme verse here, and that's in Revelation chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. I saw in the right hand of Him who sat on the throne a book, written inside and on the back, sealed up with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the book and to break its seals?" Now, the question is, what is the book? What is the scroll in some translations with these 7 seals on it? Well, Gentry suggests that it's really a covenant divorce document. This is the certificate of divorce that the Lord is giving to Israel and putting her away for her unfaithfulness. And of course it includes several judgments. Now we're going to see, or want to look at, why it is we believe that that is the case, or why Gentry sees it in this way. And I think there's a lot of good evidence here. The first evidence is that, and by the way, I should ask, were there any leftover questions from last week I forgot to ask before we... Okay, this may generate some questions, we'll see. Okay. All right. First of all, in the Old Covenant, is it your understanding that Israel was faithful to the Lord all the way down the line? Okay. No. And oftentimes, when Israel was unfaithful, the Lord likened Israel to a woman, actually his wife, that had been unfaithful. That's one of the reasons why He had Hosea, for instance, marry a harlot. And she apparently couldn't remain faithful to him and started going after other lovers and so forth. And Hosea was supposed to be then a picture of the Lord who goes after her several times, continually bringing her back to himself. But there does come a time when enough is enough. But let's look at a couple of examples. In Ezekiel 16, verse 32, and remember Ezekiel was written during the time of the exile, when the nation of Judah, remember Israel had been taken into captivity before, but now Judah is in captivity in Babylon, and Ezekiel was called to minister to the exiles there in Babylon. But he says here, "You adulterous wife who takes strangers instead of her husband." This is referring to Israel or to Judah. In Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 1, Jeremiah was actually ministering to those Jews who remained in the land after the exile, so there's some overlap between Jeremiah and Ezekiel. God says, "If a husband divorces his wife and she goes from him and belongs to another man, will he still return to her? Will not that land be completely polluted? But you are a harlot with many lovers, yet you turn to me, declares the Lord." And then Isaiah 50, verse 1. "Thus says the Lord, where is the certificate of divorce by which I have sent your mother away? Or to whom of my creditors did I sell you? Behold, you were sold for your iniquities, and for your transgressions your mother was sent away." So again, it's not unusual for the Lord to speak to Israel as an unfaithful wife, because she had been unfaithful many, many times. Now, the reason why that's important to see is because that is how Israel is pictured in the book of Revelation as well, as an unfaithful wife, as a harlot. Now, the book of Revelation deals with God's final divorce from ethnic Israel for their rejection, of course, of the Messiah, for putting him to death. The Lord is now putting them away. And you know there were many, of course, things that the Lord Jesus Christ said that indicated that judgment was coming, and it was coming because of their rejection of him. Matthew chapter 21, verses 42 through 44. Jesus said to them, "Did you not read in the Scriptures, the stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing the fruit of it. And he who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, but on whomever it falls, it will scatter him like dust." Now, again, the idea is the Lord is not saying that he's going to take away the kingdom temporarily, but rather he's taking it away from them once and for all. He's taking it away from ethnic Israel, who were the physical offspring of Abraham, in order to give it to a new nation that would produce the fruit of it, who are the spiritual offspring of Abraham, including both elect Jews and Gentiles. But this is a once and for all thing. But notice too that what's going to happen to ethnic Israel, or to the nation that formerly possessed the kingdom, that the stone is going to fall on them and scatter them like dust. This is talking about a rather severe judgment coming upon Israel. Now, the way that the Lord does this is by way of a writ of divorce, and that was something that was very common in the days of Israel. That's how infidelity was dealt with in Old Testament Israel. We have what Moses says in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, where the writ of divorce is actually established. "When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house, and she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, and if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, then the former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance." Now, this is, by the way, the reason why when we saw in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 1, if you go back up to the top of your page there, it's actually under 1a, and then was that small Roman numeral 2. God says, if a husband divorces his wife and she goes from him and belongs to another man, will he still return to her? Will not that land be completely polluted? But you are a harlot with many lovers, yet you turn to me, declares the Lord. Okay, so that is reflecting what we just saw in Deuteronomy chapter 4. Once a man puts his wife away and she becomes another man's wife, then even if that wife or the husband turns against the wife and sends her away, or the husband dies, the wife can't come back to the first husband. So that gives us, I think, also a little bit of an indication here is if God puts away his wife and takes another, whether this first one, especially since she's gone after so many others, is going to be able to return to him, at least as a nation. Okay? So this is the practice. It requires a writ of divorce, a document to send her away. And this isn't just describing what was going on. This was actually the law that was instituted to regulate divorce. As we see in Matthew 19:7. They said to him, that is to Jesus, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? This was the prescribed method of dealing with it. Well, this book, this scroll with the 7 seals, then in this scenario represents that document by which the Lord is putting his former spouse away for her many harlotries, for her unfaithfulness. Okay, now the Lord has to deal with Israel in a righteous way before he can take to himself a new bride. Okay, even though we know in the Old Testament there were certainly examples of those who were involved in polygamy, we know that that was not the Lord's intent, and the Lord is not going to be a polygamist himself. He is going to deal righteously with his unfaithful wife before he takes to himself his new bride. Now, one thing that is true, and perhaps you'll understand now why in the book of Revelation, the 144,000, what is it that was unique about those 144,000 besides the fact that they were Jewish? What's that? Elders. Well, no, I think you're thinking of the 12 elders that cast down their crowns, but that I'm sure the symbolism is probably also involved in that. But what was true of the 144,000, the 12,000 from each tribe? There was something that was unique about them. Let's off the top of my head, I'm not exactly sure. But do you know off the top of your head what was unique about them, Greg?
They'd never taken wives.
Yeah, they had never taken wives, or they were virgins, right? Now, how is it that the bride of Christ is represented in the book of Revelation as the chaste, spotless, virgin bride? Okay. Now, what is she contrasted with in the book of Revelation? The Babylon, the harlot, right? Okay. Now, in this view, then, Babylon is actually the old wife, is Israel, unfaithful Israel. Okay. And the bride of Christ is the New Jerusalem, another city. Babylon, by the way, is a city, also represented as a harlot sitting on a beast that has the 7 heads and so forth, right? And the bride of Christ is represented as a city as well, the New Jerusalem. New Jerusalem, Babylon, and even though it doesn't call it the Old Jerusalem, we're going to see that there are several things that indicate that that is the case. Okay, so the ethnic Israel and the church are actually compared and contrasted in the book of Revelation as 2 women. One of them is faithful, the other is unfaithful. One is the harlot, the other one is the chaste virgin bride. Okay, so Israel is the harlot, the one that's called Babylon, the one responsible for the death of the saints and witnesses of Christ. And anyway, here's one passage dealing with that in Revelation 17, verses 1 through 6. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, "Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot, who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. And he carried me away in the Spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality. And on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. When I saw her, I wondered greatly. Now, on the other hand, the church is the bride of Christ, the chaste bride, in Revelation 21, 2 through 4, verse 27, and then 22, 14 through 15. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And there will no longer be any death, there will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. And nothing unclean and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. Blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they may have the right to the tree of life, and may enter by the gates into the city. Outside are the dogs and the sorcerers and the immoral persons and the murderers and the idolaters and everyone who loves and practices lying. Now, these references, of course, are talking about the marriage of the bride, or of Christ with his bride, and that doesn't take place until the very end, which is why we have some rather final statements being made here. But outside, of course, are all those that did not receive the Lord Jesus Christ. Those are those burning in the lake of fire, because this takes place after the great judgment. It's not like there are people in the lake of fire, and yet outside the city there are still all these wicked people. They're actually in the lake of fire, which is outside the city, indicating that perhaps, as Jesus describes in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, that heaven and hell are going to be able to see each other still, even during the time of the eternal state. Okay. As I mentioned, they're also contrasted as two cities. There's not only the unfaithful harlot and the virgin bride, but there's also the earthly and heavenly Jerusalem. And here's one hint that, well, actually we're going to get to that in just a minute. We're going to see several comparisons between Babylon and what's said about Babylon and what's said about Jerusalem, to see that basically the same language is used to describe them. But ethnic Israel is the earthly Jerusalem. By the way, notice in Revelation 11:8 in your handout here that obviously Jerusalem is being referred to by the language of other cities, okay, and even countries in this case. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. Okay, where was Jesus crucified? In Jerusalem. And what is Jerusalem then called here? Sodom and Egypt, right? Now, ethnic Israel is also called Babylon in the book of Revelation, and it may be that what's in common between all of these three particulars is the fact that each of them persecuted God's people. Each of them were exceedingly wicked also, and each of them were idolaters, and well, I think that probably sums it up. And that's what Jerusalem has become because of her rejection of the Messiah. And we're going to see more about that in just a minute. But the church is the New Jerusalem, chapter 21, verse 10. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. Now remember that in the book of Galatians, chapter 4, verses 22 through 28, Paul makes a very similar statement regarding the two cities. Well, let me just go ahead and read it. For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the bondwoman and one by the free woman. But the son by the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and the son by the free woman through the promise. This is allegorically speaking, for these women are two covenants, one proceeding from Mount Sinai, bearing children who are to be slaves. She is Hagar. Now, this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free. She is our mother. For it is written, Rejoice, barren woman who does not bear. Break forth and shout, you who are not in labor. For more numerous are the children of the desolate than of the one who has a husband. And you, brethren, like Isaac, are children of promise. So you notice that the old Israel and new Israel, as it were, is the ethnic Israel versus the new people of God, the spiritual Jews, you might say, are contrasted as two cities, the earthly Jerusalem and the heavenly Jerusalem. So the idea is we have the same kind of a contrast brought out in the book of Revelation. We have the earthly Jerusalem, which is called Sodom, which is called Egypt, which is called Babylon, where the Lord was crucified. And then we also have the heavenly Jerusalem, which is the bride that the Lord is preparing for himself. Paul tells us that new Jerusalem is the one who is free. She is they are the children of the woman, in this case, how do you describe her here? Not Hagar, but the free woman. Won by the bondwoman who is Hagar, that's Jerusalem, and she's in bondage because still trying to earn or work out her salvation according to the works of the law. But then you have the Jerusalem above, who is the woman from the free woman through the promise. Okay. All right, is that clear so far? No? Yes? Okay. Well, we're going to see something more of that right now as we see the two of them compared and contrasted. Okay. More references to the fact that Israel and Babylon are actually the same. That is, ethnic Israel and Babylon. Revelation 18 verses 1 through 2, we see that Babylon is actually a city that is full of demonic activity. After these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illumined with his glory. And he cried out with a mighty voice, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird." So the idea here is Babylon is represented as a city that obviously is full of wickedness, and in this case, full of wickedness because full of demonic activity. This, though, is how the Lord Jesus Christ actually described the Jerusalem or Israel of his own day. Matthew chapter 12, verses 43 through 45. Now when the unclean spirit goes out of a man, it passes through waterless places seeking rest, and does not find it. Then it says, "I will return to my house from which I came." And when it comes, it finds it unoccupied, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and takes along with it 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there. And the last state of that man becomes worse than the first. That is the way it will also be with this evil generation. One thing it's interesting, and you may not expect it, and perhaps we don't even think about it, but what is one of the things that Jesus did as he was going about ministering the gospel throughout Israel? Right, he was casting out evil spirits all the time, and we keep finding references to the fact that Jesus not only healed those who were sick, but he was casting out demons. Now, how did that come about? What happened to Israel? How did it fall into such a situation like that there would be so many demon-possessed people in the land? Remember how they're characterized, how Israel is characterized as the light shines? What is it shining in? If you can think of the reference. What's that? In the darkness. The people who are sitting in the valley of the shadow of death, basically, upon them a light dawns. Now, that's because of the spiritual situation that Israel had fallen into. Because of their numerous rejections of the Lord. And remember that even after they were cast out and exiled from Israel for their infidelity and taken to Babylon, as we saw in those references at the very beginning, even when they were sent back within that first generation, they already began to apostatize again. If you recall, Ezra came and had to do some reformation. Also, Nehemiah, when he left and he came back, he found there was already corruption in the priesthood, and how I think even the enemies of God's people were allowed to have some kind of a room inside the temple, and they had intermarried already with foreign women, and I mean, they were merchandising on the Sabbath. They had already just turned away from, even after the Lord had granted them such recovery, such mercy, they were already turning away. Well, that's just before a period of time where there's 400 years more. So what happens in the 400 years when they're already apostatizing in the first generation? Well, they've fallen a long ways away from the Lord, haven't they? There's just a few, very few, that are faithful, and the rest have given themselves, over to idolatry, and because of that, they become the prey of Satan. Now, the idea here is that when Jesus Christ does his ministry for this 3.5 years, he basically sets Israel free from this oppression, from this demonic oppression, by almost banishing sickness from Palestine, and also the demonic activity. We even read in that Matthew chapter 12 passage that as well, that Jesus has bound the strong man and is beginning to plunder his house. We read in Luke 10 verses 17 through 18, when Christ had sent the 70 out, they returned with joy, saying, "Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name." And he said to them, "I was watching Satan fall from heaven like lightning." Now, the problem is that once this ministry was completed, once the demon had been cast out, as it were, but Israel had not yet embraced the Messiah, and actually continued to refuse to embrace him, that they went from bad to worse. Again, from the example in Matthew chapter 12, when Jesus talks about what happens to the man where the demon is cast out and his house is put in order, and then the demon comes back and finds it unoccupied. It's swept and everything's ready for him to really come back in again. It says that he takes seven other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there, and the last state of that man becomes worse than the first. So after Christ does this ministry, and he reveals so much of truth and light and casts out all these demons and so forth, they sin against all that light and that ministry, and they don't receive Christ so as to receive his Holy Spirit and to have, as it were, an occupant within. Satan comes back, or at least the demon, as it were, comes back, but with 7 other demons more wicked than itself, if you can imagine. I guess there's degrees of wickedness among the demons. And the last state becomes worse than the first. So now Israel, we saw how it began. So how did it end? Okay, it ended much worse, perhaps 7, 8 times as worse. Well, you can see then the correlation between Israel, its state in AD 70 after having rejected the Messiah, and this characterization of Babylon, a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit. Okay, so they have this in common. There's a great deal of demonic activity within them. Secondly, the Lord calls his people to withdraw from Jerusalem, withdraw from Babylon when the time of her judgment comes. I think that's fairly familiar. Revelation 18 verses 4 through 5. I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive of her plagues, for her sins have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities." I should mention that in this view of the book of Revelation, these plagues, these things that devastate Babylon, are those series of plagues that are going on throughout the book of Revelation. When the 7 seals are broken, when the 7 trumpets are blown, when the 7 vials are poured out. This is God's wrath then being poured out upon the harlot or upon Israel for all of their sins against him and against his people. Okay? So the idea is the Lord is calling his people to come out of Babylon before the plagues come. Now that's quite interesting, isn't it? Why would his people be in such a wicked city as this? Babylon. Babylon didn't actually exist in those days, did it? It was just a term, a symbol of wickedness. Babylon was destroyed by God's judgment, and it was said that that city would not be rebuilt again, and I believe it hasn't been rebuilt to this day. And yet here's a city that's called Babylon that's being judged. What I'm talking about is in the Old Testament, the real Babylon was destroyed, at least the physical one. But here's another Babylon where there are God's people living within and are called to come out before judgment is actually brought upon the city. But this is exactly what Jesus warned his disciples about when God was going to bring judgment upon Israel for the rejection of the Messiah, as we see in this next quote from Matthew chapter 24. "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place," let the reader understand, "then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get things out the things out of that are in the house, or in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Now, the point here is that Jesus tells his disciples, those who are his followers, that before he brings judgment on Jerusalem, that he gave them certain signs by which they would know it was at hand, so that they would be able to flee. The same thing we see in the book of Revelation when he's calling his people to come out of Babylon, that wicked city, before God brings his judgment upon her. And again, you would ask yourself the question, why would his people be there in the first place in such a wicked city that seems to be full of demon possession? Well, if he's referring to Jerusalem and referring, to Jerusalem basically, then it wouldn't be a surprise, would it? Because that's where God's people would also be. Babylon is called the Great City, but the Great City is where where Jesus was crucified. Chapter 18, verse 16, referring to Babylon, "Woe, woe, the great city! She who was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls." This almost sounds like, and by the way, this is one of the reasons why the Reformers believed that Babylon was actually referring to the Roman Catholic Church. They saw something of some false religion going on here. They saw that the purple and scarlet were colors that were often used in the Roman Church, and certainly the Roman Church is very rich. But it also just so happens that the fine linen, the purple and scarlet, are different kinds of cloth used in the priesthood in the Old Testament system. And the being adorned with gold, precious stones, and pearls almost harkens back to the days of Solomon, when he made these things so plentiful. And actually, when you read about Babylon, you almost see a list of things that were imported into Babylon that sound an awful lot like what Solomon was bringing into Jerusalem during the days of its glory. So it could be that he's drawing on that imagery to further paint exactly what this city is. But then verse 21 also calls Babylon the great city. "Then a strong angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, 'So will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence, and it will not be found any longer.'" And then we read in Revelation 11:8 what we've already seen about the two witnesses, "And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified." Now the question is the term the great city here? Is this the same great city that's being referred to by Babylon? This is the first time, Babylon is actually the first time the great city is given a name. It's called mystically Sodom and Egypt. It's the place where the Lord was crucified, but the great city is Babylon. You see the point there? So throughout the book of Revelation, you have this great city, and the great city is identified as the place where Jesus was crucified, but the great city is Babylon. Okay. Also, Babylon is said to be responsible for the death of all the righteous. Okay. Jesus, though, charges Jerusalem with that sin. Look at chapter 18, verses 20 and 24. "Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her. And in her was found the blood of the prophets and of saints and of all who have been slain on the earth." Now, I think there the word earth doesn't need to be taken as the whole global earth, but could be referring to the land. Revelation 19, verses 1 through 2. "After these things I heard something like a loud voice of a great multitude in heaven saying, 'Hallelujah! Salvation and glory and power belong to our God, because His judgments are true and righteous. For He has judged the great harlot who is corrupting the earth with her immorality, and He has avenged the blood of His bondservants on her.'" Now, doesn't that sound familiar? I mean, think about what Jesus said in Matthew 23, just before Matthew 24, where He talks about the destruction of Jerusalem and the judgment He was bringing on her. What does He say about her? He says, "Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Now, do you see the similarity between those two things? God is charging Babylon with the death of all the righteous and all the righteous blood shed on earth. And that's, they're to rejoice because judgment has come upon her. But Jesus says that that sin of the righteous blood was to be charged against Jerusalem. Okay, what would be the conclusion then between those two things? Well, the idea is that Babylon and Jerusalem are the same. Jerusalem is the great city where the Lord was crucified. It has become the inhabitant of every wicked demon and so forth. That's the condition of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is, is the city that the righteous blood is charged against. So we have these several correlations. Not only is it the great city that is identified as Babylon, also the place where Christ was crucified. When the time of her judgment comes, God calls His people to come out of her. They are both called the great city, and both are charged with the death of all the righteous. Now, this in and of itself, we might be able to say, I can still see how maybe Jesus meant just the righteous blood in that generation, but there was going to be more righteous blood shed in the future, and this is referring to some kind of a future judgment against Babylon. But don't forget the numerous time indicators in the book of Revelation, how the time is near, how don't seal up the words of this prophecy. Blessed are those who hear and understand and basically respond to this, because the time is at hand. And Jesus says, behold, I am coming quickly, and so forth. The time indicators in the book of Revelation, plus the fact that the temple was still standing, means that we're talking about a time frame that is still prior to the destruction of the temple, and yet these things were going to happen quickly. Jesus is basically saying the same thing in Matthew 23 and 24, but he is speaking in more straightforward terms. What we're seeing in the book of Revelation is really prophetic language. We see it all taking place by way of imagery, but I believe that the indications are it's referring to the same event. Does that make sense? Whatever it is that John was talking about in the book of Revelation was something that was very near, and something that the people the book was addressed to needed to read and heed, because it was so near, and a blessing pronounced upon them and so forth. But what was near was the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's really the only event that could possibly fulfill the kind of language that's being referred to here. And when we take all of these things we've just seen and the correlations between what Jesus says in more straightforward language with the visionary language, we see that it appears to be referring to the same thing. Do you see the strength of that argument? Okay. Now, what we're going to look at next, and by the way, let me just go ahead and preview, is we'll try to hopefully quickly go through the judgments and try to show some correlations. But I wanted you to see all of these things as we sort of set up the context, because if we don't see the context, we can take these images and apply them to just about anything. I think the church has proven throughout the years that the language of the book of Revelation is flexible enough to make it fit just about any scenario, right? So that's where we need to be a little bit careful. But I think the strong point of this particular view is that it does do justice to the time references in the book of Revelation, and also the ethnic target, which is Jerusalem, Judea, the Jews. It does justice, of course, to what Jesus says is going to take place. Many people recognize the correlation between Revelation and Matthew 24 and 25, but they want to project it all into the future and bring it into this time frame and something that's very near to us. But John is saying it was very near to them, and Jesus said this generation wouldn't pass away until all these things took place, and he said to the high priest that you would see the Son of Man coming on the clouds, and every eye that will see him, even those who pierced him, would see him coming on the clouds. All those references indicate that it was something that was going to happen back in those days. So we'll look at it from that perspective, and try to draw some correlation between those judgments that are being poured out in the seals and in the trumpets and the bowls, with the things that actually took place within Jerusalem when the Roman army came against it and laid siege against it for several months. Actually, I think it ends up being around, I think it's 3.5 years. Yeah. Okay, so, and the main point here is just, this is what I wanted to summarize at the end. It is a prophetic warning to the church of the coming judgment of God against ethnic Israel for her infidelity to God's covenant. And these last two statements indicate why God's judgment would be so severe against Israel. Remember that there is a principle in Scripture, and that is if a people are given light, if they're given truth, then they have a greater responsibility to live up to that truth, right? That's why the Lord said it would be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for Tyre and Sidon, or actually Capernaum, where He did His miracles and He did His preaching, because they received so much light, they saw so much evidence of the truth, and yet they turned away from the Lord, or turned away, didn't ever embrace Jesus Christ. They never committed those acts of sodomy that we read about in Sodom and Gomorrah. Morally speaking, we would say Sodom and Gomorrah are about as wicked as it gets, right? Well, they surrounded the house and tried to get Lot to bring out the two people that came so that they could basically rape them. I mean, that's what they wanted to do. That's wicked. And yet what did Capernaum do? They heard Jesus speak, they saw His miracles, but they said, no thank you. And yet when you compare those two things, Jesus says it's going to be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for Capernaum. And we think, well, why? I mean, Sodom and Gomorrah was much more wicked. Well, it's because these guys had much greater privileges, much more light. Capernaum did. Than Sodom and Gomorrah. They sinned in darkness, you see. Even though their sins were greater, they didn't sin against as much light. Now, what about a nation that has had God's light for generation after generation for hundreds of years, who reject the Messiah when He finally arrives and does a ministry that lasts for 3.5 years right in their presence? What is God going to require of them, you see? That's why the judgment that God brings on them is so much worse than anything that He has brought about on any other people, because they have sinned against the greatest light possible for centuries. So we have reference to that in Luke 10, verses 10 through 12. But whatever city you enter and they do not receive you, go out into its streets and say, even the dust of your city which clings to our feet, we wipe off and protest against you. Yet be sure of this, that the kingdom of heaven has come near. I say to you, it will be more tolerable in that day for Sodom than for that city. Again, this is talking about what's going to happen to Israel now, who rejects the gospel. And then Luke 12, verses 47 through 48, we know that Christ has in mind here the servant who knew his master's will, that's Israel, and that slave who knew his master's will and did not get ready or act in accord with his will receive many lashes. But the one who did not know it and committed deeds worthy of flogging will receive but few. And from everyone who has been given much, much will be required. And to whom they entrusted much, of him they will ask all the more. The idea is Israel was the slave who knew the master's will and committed deeds worthy of a flogging will receive many lashes, but those nations that were in darkness that committed deeds worthy of a flogging will receive but few, because to whom much is given, much is required. So Israel was given a great deal, and Israel rejected all of that light. And so God is bringing a great judgment on them, called the Great Tribulation. See, that's the whole point. So the Lord is putting Israel away for her unfaithfulness, and in doing so, I mean, He has put up with her again and again and again and again throughout the years, being patient and merciful. And even as Hosea going back and taking this faithless bride back to himself so many times, but this last time when they finally reject what everything was pointing to, the Lord finally puts them off once and for all and takes to Himself another bride. So that's why the judgments are so severe in the book of Revelation. Okay. All right, are there any questions? We actually finished with 5 minutes to spare. Yes, Bridget.
Well, we talked about the Catholic Church, and I've just been seeing on the news that the Catholic Church is allowing the monks to come and speak at, well, Notre Dame, it's a Catholic college. And they know the truth. They know that they're supposed to not, against abortion and everything, and they're still allowing you to come, and they ask for the bishops or whatever they are, to come forward and go against it, but they refuse to do it. And they're all, like even 80-85% of them are excited that he's coming.
You said Obama, right? Obama's coming. Yeah. Okay.
So they're going against what they know is the truth.
Well, that's sad to hear. We realize that the Roman Catholic Church, because of its positions on the gospel, actually as a what would you call it? Well, what would you call it? I want to call it church, but I don't want to call it a denomination because it's not a denomination. As a religion, as a religion is not, although this would blow the socks off of most Roman Catholics, is not a Christian religion because they have rejected justification by grace through faith alone. But yet, even in cases where that is the case, they may still have the same values that we have and can be co-belligerents with us against certain causes. And when that breaks down and they don't continue to fight that battle, that can be sad, even though we realize it's not a Christian denomination or a Christian church that's compromising in this way. It's still sad that we would lose someone that would be a help to us in this battle. I'm really surprised that would be the case, that they wouldn't bring that out, especially when they have him there. Maybe they don't consider it to be the proper venue to do that. I don't know, but I think their voice is still strong against abortion, isn't it? Yeah.
That's the thing, they're going against what they believe.
Right. Okay, are there any questions? Any questions or comments? Okay. Then let's close with a word of prayer.